Immanuel Kant was one of the most influential German philosophers in modern Western philosophy. His most famous work was in the area of ethics and metaphysics. Kant was born in 1724 into a household that emphasized religious devotion and a literal interpretation of the Bible. From an early age, Kant showed a great aptitude for learning. Although his family wanted him to focus on Latin and religious studies, Kant turned to what he considered the more rational disciplines of philosophy and science. He enrolled at the University of Königsberg in East Prussia, where he studied and eventually taught for his entire career. Kant's work in the area of morality was considered completely new at the time. He stated, first of all, that all humans are worthy of dignity and respect. His philosophy also said that motivation, not outcome, is the most important determinant of goodness. Thus, if one's actions are motivated by good, that person's morality is good, even if the situation does not turn out as expected. To Kant, moral actions and duty are nearly identical. Thus, a person has moral worth if they fulfill a duty, regardless of perceived personal gain. In his doctrine of transcendental idealism, Kant argued that space and time are mere forms of intuition, which structure all experience, and therefore, that while things in themselves exist and contribute to experience, they are nonetheless distinct from the objects of experience. From this, it follows that the objects of experience are mere appearances, and that the nature of things as they are in themselves is consequently unknowable to us. We are now going to present a selection from one of the greatest works in the history of philosophy, Critique of Pure Reason. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. First part, Transcendental Aesthetic. Section 1 of Space, Metaphysical Exposition of this Conception. By means of the external sense, a property of the mind, we represent to ourselves objects as without us, and these all in space. Herein alone are their shape, dimensions, and relations to each other determined or determinable. The internal sense, by means of which the mind contemplates itself or its internal state, gives indeed no intuition of the soul as an object. Yet there is, nevertheless, a determinate form, under which alone the contemplation of our internal state is possible, so that all which relates to the inward determinations of the mind is represented in relations of time. Of time we cannot have any external intuition, any more than we can have an internal intuition of space. What then are time and space? Are they real existences? Or are they merely relations or determinations of things, such, however, as would equally belong to these things in themselves, though they should never become objects of intuition? Or are they such as belong only to the form of intuition, and consequently to the subjective constitution of the mind, without which these predicates of time and space could not be attached to any object? In order to become informed on these points, we shall first give an exposition of the conception of space. By exposition, I mean the clear, though not detailed, representation of that which belongs to a conception, and an exposition is metaphysical when it contains that which represents the conception as given a priori, in principle. Space is not a conception which has been derived from outward experiences, for, in order that certain sensations may relate to something without me, that is, to something which occupies a different part of space from that in which I am, in like manner, in order that I may represent them not merely as without of and near to each other, but also in separate places, the representation of space must already exist as a foundation. Consequently, the representation of space cannot be borrowed from the relations of external phenomena through experience. But, on the contrary, this external experience is itself only possible through the said antecedent representation. Space, then, is a necessary representation a priori, which serves for the foundation of all external intuitions. We never can imagine or make a representation to ourselves of the non-existence of space, though we may easily enough think that no objects are found in it. It must, therefore, be considered as the condition of the possibility of phenomena, and by no means as a determination dependent on them, and is a representation a priori, which necessarily supplies the basis for external phenomena. Space is no discursive, or, as we say, general conception of the relations of things, but a pure intuition. For, in the first place, we can only represent to ourselves one space, and, when we talk of diverse spaces, we mean only parts of one and the same space. Moreover, these parts cannot antecede this one all-embracing space, as the component parts from which the aggregate can be made up, but can be cogitated only as existing in it. Space is essentially one, and multiplicity in it. Consequently, the general notion of spaces, of this or that space, depends solely upon limitations. Hence it follows that an a priori intuition, which is not empirical, lies at the root of all our conceptions of space. Thus, moreover, the principles of geometry, for example, that in a triangle, two sides together are greater than the third, are never deduced from general conceptions of line and triangle, but from intuition, and this a priori with apodeictic or absolute certainty. Space is represented as an infinite given quantity. Now, every conception must indeed be considered as a representation which is contained in an infinite multitude of different possible representations, which, therefore, comprises these under itself. But no conception, as such, can be so conceived as if it contained within itself an infinite multitude of representations. Nevertheless, space is so conceived of, for all parts of space are equally capable of being produced to infinity. Consequently, the original representation of space is an intuition a priori and not a conception. Section 1 of Space. Transcendental exposition of the conception of space. By a transcendental exposition, I mean the explanation of a conception as a principle, whence can be discerned the possibility of other synthetical a priori cognitions. For this purpose, it is requisite, firstly, that such cognitions do really flow from the given conception, and, secondly, that the said cognitions are only possible under the presupposition of a given mode of explaining this conception. Geometry is the science which determines the properties of space synthetically, and yet a priori. What, then, must be our representation of space, in order that such a cognition of it may be possible? It must be originally intuition, for from a mere conception no propositions can be deduced which go out beyond the conception, and yet this happens in geometry. But this intuition must be found in the mind a priori, that is, before any perception of objects, consequently must be pure, not empirical intuition. For geometrical principles are always apodeictic, that is, united with the consciousness of their necessity, as space has only 3 dimensions, but propositions of this kind cannot be empirical judgments, nor conclusions from them. Now, how can an external intuition anterior to objects themselves, and in which our conception of objects can be determined a priori, exist in the human mind? Obviously not otherwise than insofar as it has its seat in the subject only, as the formal capacity of the subjects being affected by objects, and thereby of obtaining immediate representation, that is, intuition. Consequently, only as the form of the external sense in general. Thus, it is only by means of our explanation that the possibility of geometry as a synthetical science a priori becomes comprehensible. Every mode of explanation which does not show us this possibility, although in appearance it may be similar to ours, can with the utmost certainty be distinguished from it by these marks. Wonderful viewers, it's been a pleasure to have you with us today on Words of Wisdom.